Please tell me Arcade Fire's heard of Risky Rats. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to John Lilly Speaks. I'm your host, Win Butler. I hardly know her. Montreal indie rock legends Arcade Fire formed in the early 2000s, with the growing lineup experiencing changes all the way up until their 2003 EP and their signing to Merge Records later that year. Funeral was released in the fall of 2004, and it's an undisputed classic and one of the best indie rock records of all time. Experimental with the format of its art rock foundations, it drew comparisons to Radiohead, REM, and U2, and that's for a reason. Because the stadium rock appeal of the Neighborhood series, of Rebellion Lies and Wake Up, matched the level of grit and sincerity in their messaging. So it's wild to me that what would come next would be even more astonishing. 2007's Neon Bible may not have had the same cultural impact as Funeral, but I genuinely adore it and many others did too, and that makes sense due to its Huey Lewis inspirations and epic theatrical art rock full of spectacle and drama. Speaking of, The Suburbs released in 2010, and in my opinion this was the era where Arcade Fire perfected their musical identity, with masterclass in storytelling and scope, and most importantly experimentation, which would continue into the Euro industrial dance jams of Reflector, a record from 2013 that I love more and more as time goes on, but that pushing of boundaries reached a fever pitch in 2017 with Everything Now, which admittedly, despite its dance rock gems, is a lot more of an empty effort from the band that contains genius work, no doubt, but it's undercut by its flat assembly of broad ideas. After some time away though, the band regrouped to reconnect with their conceptual roots, enlisting longtime Radiohead producer Nigel Godrich to helm We in 2022, and I recall being excited about this one upon release, primarily because of its melting pot of different Arcade Fire eras, but after a while I found it to be a lot more forgettable as a total body of work, better than Everything Now, but not by much, which has led me to feel that in recent years, Arcade Fire isn't quite capable of tapping into that raw, subdued, uncompromising energy of their early work, and tying that into the nuance and experience that they have now. And honestly, with Pink Elephant, I'm disappointed that they just can't find their way back to that, and what's the most frustrating thing about that is that they're getting in their own way. Produced by Wynn and Regime with the assistance of longtime vet Daniel Lanois, who's partially responsible for much of U2's body of work, Pink Elephant has all the familiar tenets of ascendant stadium alt-rock, but the thing is, the way it's packaged and presented honestly feels like it's trying way too hard. The ringing siren drone and crescendo of epic Blade Runner 2049 inspired instrumental grandiosity on Open Your Heart or Die Trying instills this record with seriousness from the jump, and the tone comes together as bold and mystifying. The title track that follows, the best song here in my opinion, benefits from its suppressed atmosphere, as Lanois highlights that central guitar lick and the dragging beat around it to emphasize, once again, the overt solemnity that Wynn's going for. Year of the Snake is another instrumental highlight, utilizing the feedback-driven guitar that evokes the edge, while allowing the building blocks of the dynamics to stack onto each other, driving forward to a moving climax that's eloquent, but also doesn't overdo it in its bombast. Then there's the Europop-inflected Octung Baby-inspired Circle of Trust, that boasts a sleek bass line and a danceable backbeat, finding these climbing progressions attempting to smash into the composition, but they're held back as to not stifle the anxiety of the tone behind the track. However, I think instrumentally, this is where the album dives off a cliff and does not come back. Alien Nation is generally impressive, but it's a poor retread of Radiohead's The National Anthem. And look, I'm all for using inspiration to find new pockets of a genre that haven't been explored, but this is truly just shaky imitation at its best. At its worst, it's just a misguided song. The muffled vocals from Wynn are mixed to a muddy effect. The drums are emphatic and loud, but add nothing substantial, especially when the overall product is so sprawling and wildly chaotic that it almost feels like a ploy for them to prove to us that they can still do prog rock. I don't know, it's okay and efficiently put together, but also it feels contrived and obligatory in a way that the tracks before it don't. I couldn't stand Ride or Die, which follows the Beyond Salvation interlude, and that's because the acoustic demo quality of the track turns out to be dry, uninspired, and uninteresting, despite its grasping for emotional weight. Again, not bad, but we've heard Arcade Fire do this before and do it better. I mean, why are we not following the aesthetic that the first four tracks were trending towards? Luckily, the dance rock of I Love Her Shadow gains back some goodwill, with the throbbing electropop bass line and fuzzy pop synths, proving that Arcade Fire can still be uplifting, even if the expensive synth loops and phased organs feel extremely dated and indebted to the 2015 pop rock of Walk the Moon and Neon Trees. The absolute worst song here is Save for Last with Stuck in My Head, a self-indulgent slog dog that attempts to fuse their old stadium appeal with the songwriter tilt of Dylan and Springsteen, and it's a total fucking mess. The driving tension is fairly manufactured and doesn't coalesce with the merging of synthetic and naturalistic embellishments earlier on the record. And by its end, it's just exhausting, it's repetitive, and ultimately emblematic of a pomposity that Arcade Fire has gained after all these years. It uses this maximalism and touch of nostalgia to drive a connection, but Wynn and Regine do it at the expense of true artistic growth in their instrumentals, so it leaves the record on a very sour note. Okay, so we obviously need to talk about Arcade Fire frontman Wynn Butler's 2022 sexual misconduct allegations for incidents that happened between the years of 2016 and 2020, involving numerous female fans that were as young as 18. Not great. The fallout from these accusations, despite Wynn and Regine's denial of them, has led to a windfall of complications for the band, and Pink Elephant does attempt to make sense of this fallout, with the whole idea of a pink elephant being a paradox, where avoiding a thought actually produces it. Genuinely a fascinating idea to address the controversy. The title track doesn't drill too hard into this from a personal level, but instead remains abstract enough to establish these themes competently. Year of the Snake continues on with a central theme of change and metamorphosis, and how a massive change like this isn't welcome but mandatory. How does this factor into accountability? I don't know, because that's a question that Wynn and Regine are not willing to answer. My read on Alien Nation is that it's a painful diatribe that, rather than address the controversy from a nuanced perspective, takes on a tone-deaf voice that's hostile and reeks of anti-cancel culture sentiment. Even if there's a piece of this track that's separated from the controversy itself and is just calling out those that made assumptions in the wake of the allegations, this track champions a worldview that evades responsibility under the guise of saying that the machine is broken, and I think that's a really weak way for Wynn to approach this. Talking about one-sided conversations and vague assertions that we're past saving as a society, it's just a poor songwriting design that acts as a slippery slope to worse, blander, more frustrating storytelling down the line. Ride or Die isn't bad by any means, but it's so generic and rote compared to something that clearly inspired it, 2007's Neon Bible, so ultimately it's pretty much forgettable on impact. At least Circle of Trust and I Love Her Shadow don't try to complicate their lighter touches and carefree attitude, but it's disparately sat beside tracks like Stuck in My Head, which is a self-pity fest if I've ever heard one. Wynn could have used this framework to actually holistically discuss this controversy, maybe not discuss the allegations themselves, but how his journey made him reflect on his actions, and even if this was considered consensual by him, that his actions could have been perceived a certain way, and he doesn't even fucking try. It speaks to his unwillingness to recognize his own culpability in spite of his frustration with the situation, so he spends 7 minutes trying to get us to feel bad for him as he goes on and on about quitting his job, and it just makes the whole album experience feel like a big fucking waste of time. Like I said previously, the opening few tracks dial back into a mode that's familiar for Arcade Fire, as Wynn's vocals on the title track, on Year of the Snake, and his looser delivery on Circle of Trust start us out on a pretty strong note. But it's Alien Nation that derails all of this, mainly because Wynn's vocals come through like he's shouting on a megaphone, and maybe that's the point, but it's a poor decision nonetheless. He just shouts provocative, obscure statements, while Regine parrots similar sentiments back, and it's honestly tiresome and beneath the talent level that they've displayed on previous efforts. I think the spare vocals on Ride or Die are borderline unlistenable. Again, because they're trying way too hard to drive an emotional core, but the writing doesn't do any legwork to earn it, so the performance comes off as hollow. And Stuck in My Head, well, that's probably the worst performance of Wynn Butler's entire career, with it being so up its own ass to mind meeting out of the same phrase over and over and over again, by trying to ingrain it into our brains, and yeah, it stays there, but definitely not in a flattering way. The vocal line is so annoying and grating that you can't help but remember it, and it just reminds you how poor the writing is and painstakingly dull the theme behind it is, so it literally feels like Wynn's bending over backwards to get you to side with him. In that sense, it makes the record culminate in such a deflating manner that drowns out all the magnetic portions of Arcade Fire's mystique, essentially rendering the highlights of their performance in the front half of the record as meaningless. At 10 tracks and 42 minutes, this is on the shorter side of Arcade Fire's output, but unlike its predecessor We, the starts and stops on this record really hinder the progression in the worst way. Open Your Heart or Die Trying is an authoritative instrumental opener that as a tone setter brilliantly coasts us into the title track and Year of the Snake, and after Circle of Trust, I won't lie, I thought we were in for a solid return to form based on these songs. However, the midsection with Alien Nation and Ride or Die experiences consistent failures in storytelling, composition, songwriting, performance, and overall production and aesthetics that makes for a puzzling blockade to momentum and interest. Sure, I love her shadow as a pick-me-up, but still, its dated elements are off-putting and derivative. So having such a flat version of dance rock situated before such a flat version of arena rock and stuck in my head, it ensures a rocky conclusion to this record that's short-sighted in its vision and impulsive in its decision-making. And it kills the album's ability to connect to and transform the listener like they used to. I don't think Pink Elephant is a ultimately terrible album by any means, but by Arcade Fire's standards, it's bad and definitely the worst album in their discography to date. And that's even more frustrating because there's so many great ideas baked into the fabric of this thing, but the band sabotages it, partly due to the creative directors of the project not willing to push their own boundaries and challenge their own assumptions. And in effect, that impacts the listening experience greatly, as it results in a record that's worse than boring. It's irritating. But hey, this is my perspective. You're an Arcade Fire fan. This kind of sucks how much they've slid into banality. Alright, that's all I got. Bye!